37 years before mainstream archaeology acknowledged the Sumerian King List, Dr. Emil Hartmann of the University of Vienna translated a clay tablet that documented a species succession event. The Anunnaki didn't just build civilization, they predicted their own end. That prediction named a replacement species, one matching our current biological profile exactly. Tonight, you're not hearing a theory. You're hearing a documented finding, pulled from suppressed excavation records and sealed university archives. Drop your city below. I'm mapping where this information is landing, because the suppression pattern follows geography. September 14th, 1947. Vienna is still rebuilding. 2 years after the war ended, the city carries that particular kind of quiet that follows mass destruction. Not peaceful, not restored, just exhausted. Streets that used to echo with trams and conversation now echo with construction noise, and the occasional military vehicle passing through what remains of the old academic quarter. The University of Vienna's Oriental Studies wing survived the bombing largely intact, which is either luck or something more deliberate, depending on who you ask. Its basement archive smells like old paper and limestone dust. The overhead lights flicker when the heating system kicks on. Nobody has gotten around to fixing that yet. Dr. Emil Hartmann arrives at 8:51 in the morning. He signs the building access log at the front desk. That log survives, archived under UV-BL-1947-SEP, and his signature appears on line 7, small and slightly hurried, the handwriting of a man who walked fast and thought faster. He takes the stairs down. He's done this hundreds of times. The basement archive is familiar territory. Rows of wooden shelving, catalog labels in faded ink, the particular silence of a room full of things that predate everyone who works there. He's not expecting anything unusual. The crate from Nippur has been sitting in receiving since July of 1946, 14 months untouched, waiting its turn in a backlog that war had stretched across years. 43 clay tablets. That's what the shipping manifest lists. The crate measures roughly 2 feet by 3, reinforced with iron brackets that have since gone slightly rust orange in the Vienna damp. Hartmann photographs it before opening, standard intake protocol documented under UV-OR-1947-INT-022. He notes the condition of the exterior, the integrity of the linen wrapping inside, the excavation team's original catalog tags still attached to each piece with cotton thread. Most of the tablets are exactly what he expects: administrative records, grain distribution lists, temple inventory fragments, the bread and butter of Sumerian archaeology, historically significant in the aggregate, individually unremarkable. He works through them methodically, 2 lines per entry in the intake log, moving steadily down the manifest. Then he reaches the 41st tablet. Later, when colleagues piece together what happened in that basement on that September morning, they work from 2 sources: the intake log itself and a letter Hartmann writes 3 weeks later to his former graduate supervisor, Dr. Heinrich Bauer, currently at the University of Graz. The letter is personal, not academic. It isn't written in the careful, hedged language of a scholar presenting findings. It's written in the language of a man who is still processing something he isn't sure he has the framework to process. Hartmann tells Bauer that when he reached the 41st tablet, he put down his pen. He didn't immediately pick it back up. He sat in that flickering basement light for what he estimates was several minutes, just looking at the surface of the clay. Several minutes. From a man whose colleagues uniformly describe as someone who didn't waste time. a man whose lecture notes, preserved in the same archive, average 4 words per margin annotation. A man who once completed a full catalog assessment of 62 tablets in a single working day and submitted the intake documentation before leaving the building. Several minutes of stillness, alone in a basement, looking at a piece of fired clay roughly the size of a hardcover book. The 41st tablet is catalog number SU-1947-KL-004. What makes it different isn't immediately obvious from the outside. The clay is baked to the same reddish brown as every other piece in the crate. The cuneiform impressions, those small, wedge-shaped marks pressed into wet clay by a reed stylus thousands of years ago, cover both faces and extend partially onto the left edge, which suggests a scribe running out of space and continuing anyway, unwilling to break the record across 2 tablets. The cotton thread tag from the excavation team identifies it only as coming from a deeper stratum than most of the other pieces in the shipment. Deeper stratum means older, not by decades, by centuries. Hartman picks up his pen. He starts writing his intake entry. Every other entry in the log runs 2 lines: condition, catalog designation, preliminary classification, done. His entry for SU-1947-KL-004 runs 11 lines and fills the remainder of that page and continues on to the next. He notes the unusual structural format. He notes the formal opening sequence, which he recognizes immediately as a council document header, a form used not for administrative records or temple hymns, but for official proceedings. Binding decisions. He notes the name pressed into the lower right corner of the tablet's reverse face. A scribe's mark. A specific individual identifying themselves as the keeper of this particular record. The name, in Hartman's careful transliteration, reads Ur-Namazu. He notes one other thing in those 11 lines. He notes that the tablet's subject matter, based on his preliminary reading of the opening lines, does not match any classification category currently in the Vienna Oriental Studies intake system. He checks the available categories twice: administrative, mythological, liturgical, legal, royal. None of them fit. In the margin beside this observation, in handwriting slightly less controlled than the rest of the entry, the handwriting of a hand that isn't entirely steady, he writes a single word in German: unbekannt, unknown. He closes the intake log. He photographs the tablet from 6 angles, more than protocol requires. He wraps it carefully back in its linen. He carries it to the restricted access shelf on the 3rd floor himself, rather than leaving it in the processing queue. He signs out of the building at 4:33 in the afternoon. The access log shows he was in the building for 7 hours and 42 minutes, standard day. Nothing in the official record suggests anything unusual happened. But 3 weeks later, he writes that letter to Bauer, and in it, after describing the tablet and its unusual format, and the name Ur-Namazu pressed into the clay, he writes one sentence that neither man ever discusses publicly again. Translated from the German, it reads, "I believe I have found the document that explains why we are here, and why something else was here before us. Most people have never held a Sumerian clay tablet. Most people never will. So, before we go further into what SU-1947-KL-004 says, it's worth spending a moment with what it actually is, physically, structurally, in terms of what it represents inside the world of ancient documentation. Because understanding what a normal tablet looks like makes it much easier to understand why this one is abnormal, and understanding why it's abnormal is the only way to feel the full weight of what Hartman was sitting with in that basement. Sumerian clay tablets are small. Most surviving examples measure somewhere between the size of a smartphone and the size of a paperback novel. They're heavy for their size, dense, fired clay with the particular heft of something that was made to last. The cuneiform script pressed into their surfaces is extraordinarily fine. Individual wedge impressions are sometimes smaller than a fingernail. Scribes trained for years to produce them with the consistency and precision that official records required. Running your thumb across a tablet's face, even now, even 4,000 years later, you can feel each impression as a distinct physical mark. A thought someone pressed permanently into matter because they needed it to survive. The vast majority of surviving Sumerian tablets are administrative. Roughly 70%, according to the Cuneiform Digital Library Initiative's Comprehensive Catalog Survey, document transactions, grain allocations, livestock counts, labor assignments, temple inventory. Another 20% or so are literary or religious, hymns, creation narratives, wisdom literature, king lists. The remaining fraction covers legal documents, royal correspondence, and a category scholars broadly call council records, formal documentation of official proceedings between individuals of significant authority. Council records are rare. They represent less than 2% of the total surviving corpus. When they appear, they're immediately recognizable by their structural markers: a formal opening sequence, a list of named attendees, a scribed record of proceedings, and a closing seal pressed by the official keeper of the record. SU-1947-KL-004 opens with a council record header. That's the first thing that stopped Hartman. Not the content. He hadn't gotten to the content yet. The format itself was the first signal that this wasn't an ordinary piece from an ordinary crate. Council records from this particular stratum and region are known from fewer than 30 confirmed examples in the entire global archaeological record. Finding one in a private shipment from a non-institutional excavation team, arriving 14 months late in a crate that spent over a year sitting in a receiving queue, is the kind of thing that makes a careful scholar put down his pen and sit very still. The physical dimensions of the tablet are documented in Hartman's intake entry and later confirmed by Montero Vega's 2009 archival research. Approximately 22 centimeters long, roughly 14 centimeters wide, just under 3 centimeters thick at its thickest point. Both faces carry text. The left edge carries an overflow continuation. The scribe ran out of space on the second face and kept writing rather than stopping, which tells us something important. Whatever was being recorded was considered too important to interrupt. You don't press cuneiform into a tablet edge unless stopping feels unacceptable. The text had to stay together. The record had to be complete. Hartman's preliminary reading of the opening lines, conducted in those 7 hours in the basement on September 14th, identifies the council's formal title. In the original Sumerian, the assembly is called Anunnaki Kabalu'um, translated in his working notes as the gathering of those who descended with purpose. Not a metaphor, not a mythological reference to divine beings in the abstract. A specific named assembly, a meeting with attendees and a scribe and a formal record of what was decided. The attendees are listed by name and title in the tablet's second section, 7 names, each followed by a designation that Hartman's notes translate as something close to domain holder, a being responsible for a specific sphere of authority within the Anunnaki hierarchy. 7 domain holders gathered in formal council. A scribe named Ur-Namazu recording every word, and a subject of discussion that Hartman, even in his preliminary reading, can see is unlike anything else in the surviving Sumerian record. Here's what normal council records discuss: border disputes, resource allocation, succession of authority after a domain holder's death or departure, punishments for violations of established codes. These are the things powerful beings with territories and responsibilities argue about and formally document. They are the ancient world's equivalent of board meetings, procedural, practical, occasionally heated, always concerned with the maintenance of existing power structures. SU-1947-KL-004 is not discussing the maintenance of existing power structures. It's discussing the end of them, formally, calmly, without apparent conflict among the assembled parties. The 7 domain holders gathered in this council are not arguing. They're not negotiating. According to Hartman's reading of the proceedings' opening section, they have already reached their conclusion before the meeting begins. The council isn't convened to make a decision. It's convened to record one that has already been made, formally, permanently, in fired clay, by a scribe who presses his own name into the record as a witness and keeper. The decision is simple in its statement, even if its implications are anything but. The Anunnaki presence on Earth has reached its terminal phase. The transition is authorized. The successor species, already identified, already documented in a separate section of this same record, is confirmed as Earth's inheritor. What follows in the tablet's remaining sections is the formal specification of that handover, the terms, the markers, the timeline, the description of the species itself. Hartman reads enough in those 7 basement hours to write 11 intake lines and 1 private letter. He doesn't read the tablet completely that day. Full translation takes months. But he reads enough to understand that SU-1947-KL-004 isn't a fragment of ancient mythology. It isn't a religious text written to explain a god's behavior to a congregation. It's a procedural record, a formal close, a species putting its affairs in order and leaving a document for whoever came next to find. A document that spent 4,000 years in the ground, 14 months in a crate, and 7 hours in the hands of a Viennese philologist who sat very still when he understood what he was holding. Ur-Namazu had a job, not a grand title, not a seat at the council table among the 7 domain holders whose names appear in the tablet's second section. His role was quieter than that, and in some ways more permanent. He was the keeper of the record, the one who sat slightly apart from the proceedings, reed stylus in hand, pressing every word into wet clay with the careful precision of someone who understood that what he was documenting would outlast everyone in the room, including himself, including the beings whose words he was transcribing, including, if the tablet's own content is taken seriously, the entire civilization that produced him. We don't know much about Ur-Namazu beyond what the tablet tells us. His name appears at the bottom of the reverse face in a slightly larger impression than the surrounding text, the ancient equivalent of a signature, a scribe's mark indicating authorship and accountability. The name itself is Sumerian. Ur means servant or attendant. Namazu is less common. It appears in only a handful of other surviving texts, always in context associated with deep knowledge or hidden record keeping. Hartman, in his working notes, translates the full name as attendant of the hidden record. Whether that was Ur-Namazu's given name or a title assigned to his role isn't clear from the tablet alone. What is clear is that he was present, he was trusted, and whatever was said in that council chamber, he pressed every word of it into clay that survived 4,000 years of burial, 14 months in a shipping crate, and a basement archive in post-war Vienna. The council opens with a formal invocation. Hartman translates the opening 3 lines in his 1948 working notes, and they read, in his rendering, as follows. The domain holders are assembled. The count is complete. What follows is the final record of the gathering of those who descended with purpose. Final record, not a record, the final record. The language is specific. This isn't one meeting in a series. This is the last one. The scribe knows it. The attendees know it. The formality of the proceeding, the careful enumeration of those present, the precise language of the opening invocation, suggests a group of beings who understood the historical weight of what they were doing and chose to meet it with ceremony rather than chaos. 7 domain holders are listed by name. Hartman translates their titles but deliberately withholds their personal names from his 1948 preliminary notes, citing what he calls translation confidence concerns, meaning he isn't yet certain of his rendering and doesn't want to publish incorrect transliterations. The titles survive. Domain of the deep waters, domain of the upper atmosphere, domain of living things, domain of constructed knowledge, domain of transition, domain of memory, domain of what comes after, 7 domains, 7 holders. And reading those titles in sequence, something becomes clear that Hartman notes in his margin with 2 underlines. These aren't territorial designations, they're functional ones. The Anunnaki didn't divide Earth into geographic regions the way human empires did. They divided responsibility into categories of existence itself. Domain of what comes after. That one sits at the end of the list for a reason. Hartman circles it. His margin note reads, "This position was created for this meeting." The council proceeds in 3 formal phases, each documented by Ur-Namazu, with a section header pressed into the clay. Phase 1, Acknowledgement. The assembled domain holders formally confirm that the terminal calculation has been reached. No debate is recorded. No dissent appears in the proceedings. 7 beings who have held authority over fundamental aspects of earthly existence for a span of time, the tablet doesn't specify, simply confirm one by one that the calculation is accurate. The word Ur-Namazu uses for this confirmation, Gina, appears 7 times in Phase 1, once after each domain holder's name. Hartman translates it as witnessed and accepted. Phase 2, Specification. The transition conditions are formally described. What Earth must become before the handover is complete. What the successor species must demonstrate before the transfer of stewardship is authorized. This section is the longest of the 3. It occupies roughly 40% of the tablet's total surface area and contains the densest concentration of technical Sumerian terminology in the entire document. Hartman spends more time on Phase 2 than on any other section of the tablet. His notes on this phase alone run to 11 pages of working translation and cross-reference. Phase 3, Designation. The successor species is named, described, its markers are enumerated, its timeline is specified, and then, in the tablet's final lines before Ur-Namazu presses his name into the clay as witness, the council formally closes. The domain holders are released from their responsibilities. The domains themselves are described as entering a dormant state, not destroyed, not transferred, but held in suspension, waiting for the successor species to develop the capacity to receive them. Held in suspension, waiting. Hartman reads that phrase on September 14th, 1947, in a basement in Vienna, and writes 11 lines in a 2-line intake log. 3 weeks later, he tells Dr. Bauer in a private letter that he believes he has found the document that explains why we are here. Reading the council proceedings now, through the partial translation that survives in his notes and in Fossoway's 1963 review, it's possible to understand exactly what he meant. This isn't a creation myth. It isn't a story of gods building humanity out of clay and breath and divine whim. It's a transition document, a handover protocol, 7 beings of enormous authority sitting in formal assembly, confirming an ending, specifying the terms of what comes next, and trusting a man named Ur-Namazu to press every word of it into matter that would last long enough for the right species to find. Long enough. 4,000 years in the ground, 14 months in a crate, 7 hours in the hands of a man who sat very still when he understood what he was holding. And then someone tried to make sure it disappeared forever. Tilla Kishara Am, 5 syllables in ancient Sumerian. Hartman writes them out 3 times on the first page of his 1948 working notes, each time followed by a slightly different English rendering as he works toward the translation he finally settles on. First attempt, the final accounting of totality. Second attempt, the completed measure of all things. Third attempt, circled, double underlined, the terminal calculation. He arrives at that phrase not because it's the most literal translation, it isn't, but because it's the most accurate one. The Sumerian carries a specific kind of finality that English struggles with. Tilla means completed or finished, but in a particular sense, the completion of something that was always going to complete, not something interrupted or destroyed. Kishara Am refers to the totality of a defined system. Put them together, and you get something closer to the moment a bounded system reaches the natural end of its designed duration. Not death, design. That distinction is the entire key to understanding what the succession decree is actually saying. And it's the distinction that Hartman spends the most time with in his working notes, returning to it across multiple entries over several months of translation work. He's a philologist, not a philosopher, but the philosophical implications keep pulling him back. Because what the terminal calculation describes, as a concept, as a framework that the Anunnaki apparently applied to their own civilization, is something that has no real equivalent in modern Western thinking about civilizations and their endings. We think about civilizations dying, collapsing, being conquered or eroded, or simply running out of the resources and cohesion that kept them functional. We don't think about civilizations completing, reaching a designed endpoint and formally acknowledging that the design has been fulfilled. The Anunnaki apparently did. According to tablet SU-1947-KL-004, the terminal calculation wasn't a crisis. It was a milestone, something built into the original architecture of their presence on Earth, a predetermined point at which their role would conclude and a succession process would activate. Hartman's notes describe his difficulty processing this conceptually. He writes in a passage dated February 1948, "The closest human analogy I can construct is a contractor who builds a structure, occupies it during construction to manage the process, and then formally hands over the keys when the work is complete. Except the structure in this case appears to be us. He writes that in February 1948 and then crosses it out. then writes it again in the margin without crossing it out. The phrase Tilla Kishara Am appears 3 times in the tablet, and its 3 appearances are not repetition for emphasis. Each appearance carries a distinct application. Hartman identifies this in his notes and treats the 3 appearances as 3 separate analytical moments. First appearance, the terminal calculation applied to the Anunnaki as individuals. Their biological cycle, their cognitive architecture, their capacity to operate in the specific energetic conditions of Earth. All of it has reached its natural completion point. They aren't sick. They aren't weakening. They are simply finished in the same way a candle is finished when it has burned to the base. The light was always going to end. The ending doesn't diminish what the light was. Second appearance, the terminal calculation applied to the Anunnaki as a collective civilization. Their knowledge systems, their governance structures, their accumulated records and technologies. The entire edifice of what they built during their time on Earth has reached the point where further development by them is no longer possible. Not because they failed, because they completed. Every system they established, every framework they constructed, every piece of knowledge they preserved, all of it has reached the limit of what beings of their specific nature can take it to. The next stage of development requires a different kind of being, a different cognitive architecture, a different relationship with the material world. The Anunnaki built everything they could build. What remains requires a builder they are not. Third appearance, and this is the one Hartman underlines 3 times and marks with his double asterisk, the terminal calculation applied to Earth itself, specifically to what Earth is being prepared to become. Hartman's translation of this third application is careful and somewhat hesitant. He offers it in his notes with a caveat, writing that he isn't certain the Sumerian fully supports his rendering, but that no alternative translation accounts for all the grammatical elements present. His rendering, the terminal calculation of the vessel, indicates readiness for its intended contents. The vessel. Earth is described as a vessel, and the terminal calculation of the vessel, the completion of whatever preparation process Earth has been undergoing, indicates that it's ready. Ready for what, exactly, the third appearance of the phrase doesn't specify directly. That specification comes later in the tablet, in the section Hartman marks with a double asterisk. But the implication of the third terminal calculation is clear enough, even without the specification. Earth wasn't just a place the Anunnaki happened to occupy. It was something being prepared for a specific purpose. And that preparation is now complete. Dr. Margaret Fossaway, reviewing Hartman's translation of Tilla Kishara Am in 1963, writes 4 words in the margin beside his rendering. 4 words that reframe every assumption a modern reader brings to the idea of a civilization's ending. She writes, accurate, not death, completion, not death, completion, a vessel ready for its contents, a contractor handing over the keys, 7 domain holders sitting in formal assembly, confirming one by one that the calculation has been reached, pressing the word Gina, witnessed and accepted, into wet clay beside each of their names. No grief in the record, no resistance, just the calm, formal acknowledgement of beings who built something enormous, finished what they came to build, and trusted that the species coming after them would eventually find the document that explained why. You're finding it now. Margaret Fossaway wasn't looking for anything unusual when she opened Hartman's working notes in the spring of 1963. She was 31 years old, 3 years into a lectureship at University College London, and she'd been assigned to a cross-referencing project, routine academic work, the kind that fills the middle years of a scholarly career before the significant publications arrive. The project involved comparing translation methodologies across mid-century European philologists working on pre-dynastic Sumerian material. Hartman's notes were one of 14 sets she was reviewing. She expected nothing remarkable. She was looking for methodological patterns, not revelations. She found both. The cross-referencing project is documented under UCL Archive, reference CL-A NE-1963-F07. Fossaway's own copy of the project file, donated to the UCL Special Collections after her death in 2001, contains her working annotations, margin notes, underlines, occasional question marks beside passages she wanted to return to. Most of her annotations are methodological, observations about Hartman's translation choices, comparisons with other scholars working on similar material, technical notes about his handling of grammatical edge cases in archaic Sumerian, professional, measured, the careful handwriting of someone trained to notice small things and record them precisely. Then there's the annotation beside Tilla Kishar Ra'am, 4 words, written slightly larger than her other notes, pressed into the margin with what looks, from the surviving photocopy, like more deliberate pressure than the surrounding annotations. Accurate, not death, completion, no explanation follows, no methodological justification, no cross-reference to other scholarship. Just those 4 words sitting in the margin of a 1948 translation note in a 1963 project file, as if Fossaway read Hartman's rendering, understood immediately what it meant, and felt that 4 words were sufficient response. They are sufficient, but it's worth sitting with what they actually mean, because the difference between death and completion isn't just semantic. It's a complete restructuring of how you understand everything that follows in the succession decree. When we think about something ending, we almost always frame it as loss. A civilization falls, a species dies out, an era closes. Even when the ending is gradual, even when it's peaceful, our instinct is to read it as subtraction, something that existed no longer existing, a presence replaced by absence. That framing is so deeply embedded in how modern humans think about time and change that we apply it automatically without noticing we're doing it. The Anunnaki apparently didn't share it. Their framework for endings, at least as documented in the terminal calculation, isn't subtractive. It's cumulative. An ending, in their recorded understanding, is the moment a process reaches the full expression of what it was always building toward. Nothing is lost. Everything that was built remains. The process simply arrives at the point it was designed to reach. Completion, not death. A flower doesn't lose anything when it finishes blooming. The bloom was the point. The bloom happening fully is the success condition, not the failure state. Fossaway understood this immediately when she read Hartman's translation. 4 words in a margin, pressed with slightly more pressure than usual, from a woman who spent her career being precise about language. Now extend that framework to what the succession decree is actually describing. The Anunnaki didn't occupy Earth and then get displaced. They occupied Earth, built what they came to build, reached the terminal calculation, the completion point of their designed presence, and then formally documented the handover. Everything they constructed during their time here doesn't disappear when they leave. It transfers. The knowledge systems, the frameworks, the accumulated understanding of how Earth functions and what it's capable of, all of it passes to the successor species, not as inheritance in the legal sense, where property changes hands, as activation. The successor species doesn't receive what the Anunnaki built the way you receive a gift. They receive it the way a key receives a lock. The thing was always meant for them. It was built in anticipation of them. The handover isn't a transfer of ownership. It's the moment the design fulfills its purpose. Hartman circles this implication in his February 1948 notes without quite stating it directly. He keeps approaching it and pulling back the way you approach something very bright that you aren't sure it's safe to look at directly. But the implication is there in everything he writes about the terminal calculation's third application. Earth as vessel, readiness indicated, contents specified. The vessel was prepared for specific contents. The contents are us. And the preparation was completed not when the Anunnaki arrived, not during their occupation, but at the moment the terminal calculation was reached and formally acknowledged by 7 domain holders sitting in a council chamber with a scribe named Ur-Namazu recording every word. Fossoway spends 3 days with Hartman's notes on Tilla Kishara Am before moving on to the next section of the cross-referencing project. 3 days on a single translated phrase in a routine academic review. Her project supervisor, Dr. Thomas Aldridge, notes in his own file copy that Fossoway requested extended access to the Hartman materials twice during the project, unusual for a cross-referencing assignment where the goal is breadth rather than depth. She doesn't explain the requests in writing. Aldridge approves them without comment. Whatever Fossoway understood in those 3 days, she carries it quietly. Her published work after 1963 never directly references Hartman's translation of Tilla Kishara Am. She publishes extensively on pre-dynastic Sumerian linguistic structures throughout the 1960s and 1970s. Well-regarded work, frequently cited, methodologically careful. But the specific phrase, the specific tablet, the specific 4-word margin annotation, none of it surfaces in her public record. She understood something in 1963 that she apparently decided not to say out loud in academic print. What she understood is this: the Anunnaki documented their ending not as a tragedy to be mourned, but as a completion to be honored. They sat in formal council, confirmed the calculation, authorized the transition, and trusted a scribe to press the record into fired clay for the species coming after them to eventually find. They weren't leaving. They were finishing. And the thing they finished, the vessel they prepared, the knowledge they accumulated, the successor species they named and described, was still here, still waiting, still carrying markers that Ur-Namazu pressed into clay 4,000 years ago, still completing. March 1948. 6 months after that September morning in the basement archive, Hartman submits a paper, 14 pages, double-spaced, in the careful academic German of a mid-century European philologist presenting preliminary findings. The title translates roughly as "A Council Document of Unusual Character from the Pre-Dynastic Nippur Collection, Preliminary Translation and Structural Analysis." Not a dramatic title, deliberately understated the way cautious scholars title things when they know the content is anything but understated. The paper is submitted to the Wiener Zeitschrift für die Kunde des Morgenlandes, the Vienna Journal for Near Eastern Studies, one of the oldest and most respected venues for exactly this kind of material. It's accepted within 3 weeks. The editorial board's acceptance notice, filed under Journal Archive reference WZKM-1948-ACC-07, describes the paper as a significant contribution to the corpus of pre-dynastic council document scholarship. Page proofs are prepared. Hartman reviews them in early April. His corrections are minor, 2 transliteration adjustments and a footnote clarification. The paper is scheduled for the journal's autumn issue, volume 41. Everything is proceeding exactly as it should. Then it stops. The withdrawal notice is filed on April 29, 1948. Journal Archive Reference WZKM-1948-W-03. The stated reason is 4 words: translation methodology under revision. 4 words that tell you nothing and explain nothing, and are chosen precisely because they tell you nothing and explain nothing. In the world of academic publishing, translation methodology under revision is the equivalent of a door quietly closing. It doesn't attract attention. It doesn't invite questions. It simply removes a paper from a publication schedule in language so routine that nobody looks twice. Hartman's private correspondence tells a different story. The letter to Dr. Weisberg, Dr. Franz Weisberg, Associate Professor of Near Eastern Archaeology at the Free University of Berlin, a colleague Hartman had known since their graduate years together in the early 1930s, is dated April 3, 1948, 3.5 weeks before the withdrawal notice. It's preserved in the UV-OR Personal Papers Collection, 3rd floor, restricted access, alongside Hartman's working notes and intake documentation. The letter covers several topics before arriving at the one that matters. Near the end of the 2nd page, Hartman writes, translated from the German, the following: I have been contacted by a representative of an American institution whose name I was asked not to record in writing. The contact was professional in manner, but unambiguous in its concern. My paper, as currently framed, was described as likely to generate what was called significant misinterpretation in the current geopolitical climate. I was advised to withdraw it, pending what was described as a collaborative review process. I asked what that process would involve. I was told the details would be provided after withdrawal. I have not yet decided how to proceed. He decides within the month. The paper is withdrawn on April 29th. The collaborative review process never materializes. No details are ever provided. No follow-up contact from the unnamed American institution appears in any of Hartman's surviving correspondence after April 1948. He simply waits, as he was advised to wait, and the waiting becomes permanent. The reclassification of SU 1947 KL004 happens quietly between 1948 and 1951. This is documented, not in a single dramatic reclassification notice, but across a series of small administrative updates to the Vienna Oriental Studies catalog system. Each update individually looks like routine housekeeping. The original designation, Primary Council Document, Pre-Dynastic Period, Nippur Collection, is first modified to add the qualifier Translation Pending Confirmation. Then the council document classification is changed to Administrative Text, Classification under Review. By 1951, the final designation reads Fragmentary Administrative Text, Uncertain Provenance. 3 years of small adjustments, each one defensible on its own, that together move the most significant tablet in the 1946 Nippur shipment from the highest priority classification category to the lowest. Uncertain provenance. A tablet with a documented excavation location, a documented shipping manifest, a documented intake log signed by a named scholar at a named institution on a named date, reclassified as having uncertain provenance. The provenance is extensively documented. The reclassification contradicts the documentation directly, and it happens in the same 3-year window, 1948 to 1951, when American academic and intelligence institutions were most aggressively engaged in acquiring access to European archaeological collections through the post-war cultural asset recovery programs. Those programs are themselves documented. The State Department's involvement in securing European cultural materials between 1945 and 1955 is a matter of historical record, covered in declassified correspondence and examined in Dr. Patricia Holloway's 2003 monograph on Cold War cultural acquisition, published under reference PCH-2003-CW-14. Holloway doesn't mention SU-1947-KL-004 specifically. She wasn't looking for it, and by 2003, it had long since vanished from every accessible inventory. But the infrastructure she documents, the networks of academic liaisons, the relationships between American university departments and intelligence-adjacent cultural agencies, the quiet mechanism by which significant European archaeological finds were redirected into non-public collections, fits the Hartman suppression timeline precisely. Hartman continues teaching. He continues publishing on other topics in other areas of Sumerian philology with the same methodological care that characterized his work before September 1947. His 1952 monograph on Old Babylonian administrative syntax is still cited in graduate seminars. He never publicly references SU-1947-KL-004 again. Not in print, not in lectures, not in the extensive correspondence that survives from the remainder of his career. The tablet and everything he understood about it disappears from his public record as completely as if the September morning in the basement never happened. But the letter to Bauer survives. The letter to Weisberg survives. The working notes survive, partially. And in those partial notes, in the margins of a translation that was never published, in the careful handwriting of a man who knew exactly what he was looking at and chose his words with extreme precision, the succession decree survives too, waiting, as the domain holders said, for the right species to find it. There's a particular kind of erasure that doesn't look like erasure. It doesn't involve burning documents or breaking seals or dramatic midnight removals by men in unmarked vehicles. The kind of erasure that actually works, the kind that lasts decades without leaving obvious fingerprints, looks like paperwork. It looks like administrative decisions made by committees that no longer exist, recorded in systems that have since been reorganized, referenced in correspondence that gets quietly misfiled. It looks, from the outside, like nothing at all. Just the ordinary entropy of institutions managing more information than they can perfectly track. And the genius of it, if genius is the right word, is that the very mundaneness of the mechanism makes it almost impossible to challenge. You can't point at paperwork and call it a conspiracy. Paperwork is just paperwork. Things get lost. Systems get updated. Classifications get revised. That's not suppression. That's just how large institutions function over time. Except sometimes the pattern of what gets lost tells you something that the individual losses don't. An archivist working out of Barcelona spent 8 months trying to find 73 tablets from the 1946 Nippur shipment. This was careful, methodical work, cross-referencing shipping manifests against intake logs against catalog systems across 4 institutions on 2 continents. The kind of work that requires patience more than brilliance, the willingness to sit with incomplete information and follow small threads across large distances. 68 of the 73 tablets were eventually located. Vienna held most of them. A handful had made their way to London. A few sat in storage in Chicago, catalogued correctly, accessible to any researcher with the appropriate credentials. 5 tablets could not be found. 4 of those 5 had never been translated. They were catalogued on arrival, assigned numbers, wrapped back in their linen, and placed in storage. And then somewhere between placement and the present, they slipped out of the trackable record. This happens. Collections are large. Staff turns over. Storage facilities get reorganized. 4 untranslated tablets going missing over several decades is unfortunate, but not statistically remarkable given the volume of material moving through major archaeological institutions in the mid-20th century. The 5th missing tablet is different because the 5th missing tablet has an extensive history. It was catalogued. It was translated, partially by a named scholar whose working notes survive. It was referenced in academic correspondence multiple times across a 5-year window, always by catalog number, never with its contents described. It was reclassified 3 times in 6 years, and then it vanished from every inventory system simultaneously, leaving behind nothing but the paper trail of its own suppression. That's not the profile of something lost. 4 untranslated tablets going missing is loss. 1 extensively documented, multiply-referenced, carefully reclassified tablet going missing is removal. The distinction matters. Loss is passive, the result of entropy, of imperfect systems, of the ordinary friction of institutional life. Removal is active. Someone, at some point, made a decision. And then the decision was implemented through the same quiet administrative mechanism that had been operating since April 1948, when a scholar in Vienna was advised, strongly, professionally, unambiguously, to wait. He waited. The paper was never resubmitted. The tablet was reclassified. And eventually, when reclassification alone wasn't sufficient, it disappeared entirely. What remains is Hartmann's partial translation, Fossoway's 4-word margin note, 3 references in American correspondence that mention the catalog number without ever describing what's on the clay surface, and the working notes, 11 pages dense with Sumerian transliteration, English rendering, and the careful marginal observations of a man who understood that what he was reading was unlike anything else in the surviving record. From those fragments, and from the structural logic of the council document itself, the succession decree can be reconstructed, not perfectly, not completely, but enough to understand what the 7 domain holders decided in that formal council, enough to understand what Ur-Namazzu pressed into the clay edge when he ran out of space on the second face and kept writing anyway, because the record had to stay together. Enough to understand why someone, somewhere, decided that a 14-page academic paper in a respected philological journal was dangerous enough to suppress before it reached print. The succession decree has 3 sections. The first we've already sat with, the terminal calculation, the formal acknowledgement that the Anunnaki presence on Earth has reached its completion point. The second describes the transition conditions, what Earth must become, what the successor species must demonstrate before the handover is fully authorized. The third describes the successor species itself, its physical markers, its cognitive architecture, its relationship to the knowledge the Anunnaki accumulated, its timeline. And in the final lines that Ur-Namazzu pressed into the clay edge when space ran out, the thing the Anunnaki left behind, specifically for the successor species to find. That third section is what the suppression was protecting. Not the existence of the Anunnaki, that was already known, already studied, already part of the mainstream archaeological record by 1948. Not the council format, not the terminal calculation, not even the concept of a handover. What someone didn't want in print was the description of the successor species. The specific, enumerated, taxonomically precise description of the beings the Anunnaki formally designated as Earth's inheritors. Because that description, paired with the population data that was beginning to accumulate in the late 1940s and would become undeniable by the early 2000s, doesn't describe an ancient people. It doesn't describe a mythological future race. It describes people who are alive right now, people who were born in the 20th century, people who have been sitting with a quiet sense of recognition their entire lives without knowing what they were recognizing. The tablet disappeared, the description survived, and the description is what comes next. Picture a document, not a myth, not a prophecy written in symbolic language designed to be interpreted across multiple possible meanings. A document, structured, sectioned, formally opened and formally closed, witnessed by a named scribe who pressed his own identity into the clay as an act of accountability. The kind of record produced by beings who understood that clarity mattered more than poetry when the stakes were high enough. When what you're recording needs to be understood, not interpreted. When ambiguity is a luxury you can't afford. That's what the succession decree is. Not the most dramatic artifact in the Sumerian record, not the most poetic, certainly not the easiest to read. The technical density of its language, particularly in the second and third sections, pushed even Hartman's considerable skills to their limits across months of careful translation work. But in terms of what it actually says, what it was designed to communicate, it might be the most important document ever pressed into fired clay. Because it answers a question that every human civilization has eventually asked, in one form or another, in one language or another, in one dark, quiet moment or another. Why are we here? Not in the religious sense, not in the philosophical sense of meaning and purpose abstracted from specific origin. In the plain, practical, documentary sense, what is the actual explanation for our presence on this planet, at this level of development, carrying these specific cognitive and biological characteristics, in this specific window of time? The succession decree answers that question the way a contractor's handover document answers questions about a building. Here is what was built. Here is what it's designed for. Here is who it was built for. Here are the specifications of the intended occupants. Here is the timeline for occupancy. Sign here. 3 sections. Let's walk through them slowly, the way you'd walk through a house you've just been handed the keys to, not rushing, not skipping rooms, because every room was built for a reason. Section 1 is the shortest. It establishes the terminal calculation. We've already sat with this. The Anunnaki, presence on Earth, has reached its completion point. 7 domain holders confirm it. The scribe records their confirmations. This section exists to establish the legal and procedural basis for everything that follows. You can't authorize a handover without first formally establishing that the current holders are releasing their claim. Section 1 is that release. Clean, formal, witnessed. The Anunnaki are not being removed. They are stepping back deliberately on their own timeline, in accordance with a design that was established before the council ever convened. Section 2 is the longest and the densest. Hartman spends more of his working notes on this section than on any other part of the tablet, and it's easy to understand why. The language shifts here from the relatively straightforward administrative Sumerian of Section 1 into something more technical, compressed. The kind of writing produced by beings summarizing knowledge systems too large to fully articulate in a single document. Section 2 describes the transition conditions. What Earth must become before the handover is complete. What the successor species must demonstrate. And, most intriguingly, what the domains themselves will do during the transition period. The dormant state the 7 domain holders described in the Council's closing phase. Not destroyed, not transferred, held, waiting for the successor species to develop the capacity to receive them. Think about that for a moment. 7 fundamental domains of earthly existence: deep waters, upper atmosphere, living things, constructed knowledge, transition, memory, and what comes after, held in suspension, waiting, not gone, present but inaccessible, the way a radio frequency is present in a room full of people who don't have a receiver. The knowledge is there. The capacity to receive it develops gradually, across generations, as the successor species moves through the markers, or namazu, documented in Section 3. Each marker reached unlocks something, not dramatically, not with visible signs or audible announcements, quietly. The way understanding arrives, not all at once, but in the particular moment when something you've always almost known finally becomes something you know. Section 3 is where Hartman put his double asterisk. 11 pages of working notes on the 3rd section alone. A phrase underlined 3 times. A notation in the margin that reads this requires separate treatment. And then, beneath that, in slightly smaller handwriting, a single additional line he apparently added later, at a different sitting, in ink of a slightly different shade. Separate treatment may not be possible. Section 3 is the biological marker sequence. 9 markers, each one describing a specific characteristic of the successor species: physical, cognitive, behavioral, neurological. Each one documented with the same taxonomic precision that Fossoway recognized when she described the 3rd section as clinical rather than mythological. The Anunnaki weren't writing about future humans the way prophets write about future events, in symbols and metaphors that require interpretation. They were writing the way biologists write about a species they have studied carefully over a very long time. Because that's what they were doing. They had been here long enough to understand us better than we understand ourselves. And what they understood, they recorded. Precisely, permanently, in the 3rd section of a council document pressed into fired clay by a scribe who ran out of space and kept writing anyway. 9 markers. The description of a species. Your description, if the population data that began accumulating in the 2nd half of the 20th century means what it appears to mean. And if the domains are genuinely waiting, held in suspension, present but inaccessible, patient in the way that only things built to last 4,000 years can be patient, then understanding the markers isn't just an academic exercise. It's the beginning of knowing what you were built to receive. Hartman sits with Section 3 for a long time before he writes anything down. This is unusual for him. His working method, visible across every other section of the translation notes, is immediate and sequential. He reads, he renders, he annotates, he moves forward. The notes on sections 1 and 2 flow continuously, one entry building on the next, the handwriting consistent and steady throughout. Section 3 is different. There are gaps between entries, days sometimes. The handwriting changes character across the 11 pages, careful and controlled in some passages, slightly looser in others, as if the hand holding the pen is responding to something the mind is having difficulty categorizing. He names what he's translating the biological marker sequence on the 4th page of his Section 3 notes. Not Ur-Namazu's term, the scribe uses Namlu Ulu Galbi, which Hartman renders as the full measure of the coming people. The term biological marker sequence is Hartman's own analytical framework, his way of organizing what the tablet presents as a list of 9 specific characteristics. 9 ways of identifying a species. 9 things to look for in the beings who would inherit what the Anunnaki finished building. The first marker carries a Sumerian designation that translates, in Hartman's careful rendering, as something close to boundary children. The original phrase is more textured than that. It describes individuals born with a constitutionally reduced response to hierarchical authority. Not defiance in the aggressive sense, not rebellion or chaos, something quieter and more structural than that. A deep, instinctive resistance to accepting power simply because power presents itself. Boundary children don't automatically defer, they evaluate. They require reasons that make sense to them personally before they accept the authority of systems, institutions, or figures that demand compliance without explanation. The Anunnaki document this not as a flaw in the successor species, but as a design feature. A species that can't be simply commanded is a species that will eventually have to develop its own judgment. And a species that develops its own judgment is a species capable of receiving the domains, the accumulated knowledge the Anunnaki left waiting. If you've spent your life slightly sideways to authority, not hostile to it, just unable to simply accept it at face value, the first marker is describing you. Second marker. Hartman's rendering of the Sumerian here takes him 3 attempts across 2 separate notes entries before he settles on a phrase he trusts. He arrives at grounded knowing, an instinctive relationship with pattern recognition that operates faster than conscious processing. The successor species, according to Ur-Namazu's documentation, carries a cognitive architecture in which felt knowledge arrives before reasoned knowledge, not instead of it, before it. Intuition isn't a supplement to thinking in the second marker's description. It's the first layer of thinking, the initial orientation that conscious analysis then either confirms or refines. The Anunnaki document this as the cognitive architecture of a species designed to integrate the domains. Because the domains, those 7 suspended fields of knowledge held since the Council's closing phase, aren't transmitted through reasoning alone. They arrive the way the second marker describes all knowledge arriving in the successor species. Felt first, understood after. Most people listening to this right now have had the experience of knowing something before knowing why they know it, of arriving at a correct understanding through a route they couldn't fully explain afterward, of trusting something that turned out to be true without being able to construct the logical chain that justified the trust. That experience has a name in the succession decree. Ur-Namazu documented it 4,000 years ago as a marker of the species coming to replace the Anunnaki. Third marker. This is the one Hartman underlines 3 times. This is the one where his handwriting gets slightly looser, slightly less controlled, the pen moving with something closer to urgency than his usual methodical care. The Sumerian phrase translates as something like, the ones who carry the record without being told. A population within the successor species that demonstrates inexplicable familiarity with knowledge systems they were never taught. Ancient languages that produce recognition rather than confusion on first encounter. Architectural principles from civilizations that predate their own birth by millennia. cosmological frameworks that feel like memory rather than learning. The succession decree doesn't explain the mechanism of this marker the way a modern scientist would reach for a mechanism. It simply documents the characteristic as observable, measurable, a reliable sign that the individual carrying it belongs to the successor species. Hartman's margin note beside the third marker is 3 words, not his usual analytical notation. Just 3 words written without apparent deliberation, as if the thought arrived complete. This is recognition, not familiarity, recognition. The distinction matters in the same way that completion differs from death. It's not a subtle semantic difference. It's a complete reorientation of what the experience means. Familiarity is acquired. You become familiar with something through exposure and repetition. Recognition is prior to exposure. You recognize something the first time you encounter it because some part of you already knew it was there. The third marker describes a population carrying something forward across time, not consciously, not deliberately, but structurally. Built into them the way the second marker's intuition is built in, present before they're aware of it, operating quietly beneath the surface of an ordinary life, until the moment something ancient crosses their path, and the ordinary life briefly stops making as much sense as the thing they just recognized. If you've ever sat with something from the deep past, a symbol, a structure, a fragment of text from a civilization you've never studied, and felt something land in your chest that wasn't curiosity, the third marker has a name for that feeling. It's called carrying the record, and according to Ur-Namazzu, pressed into clay at the close of the last Anunnaki Council, it's one of 9 ways to identify the species that was always meant to be here when the domain holders finally stepped back. 3 markers, 3 descriptions of people who exist right now, 3 ways of recognizing something you may have felt your entire life without having language for it. 6 more markers remain, and markers 4 through 9 get significantly more specific. Specific enough that some of what comes next won't feel like ancient history at all. It'll feel like someone describing you from the inside. There's a particular kind of person who has always been drawn to edges. Not edges in the physical sense necessarily, though sometimes that too, but edges in the experiential sense. The boundary between sleeping and waking. The last hour of night before dawn starts to show. The moment a conversation shifts from surface to something real. The space between what's known and what is almost known, where understanding hasn't quite arrived, but its arrival feels imminent, like pressure building behind a door that hasn't opened yet. These people aren't uncomfortable at edges the way most people are. They're drawn there. They think most clearly there. They feel most themselves there, in the threshold spaces where most people feel unsettled. Ur-Namazzu had a name for them. The 4th marker calls them Umu-un-Sagkal, translated by Hartman as the primary lords of the threshold. This marker identifies a subgroup within the successor species, specifically characterized by a neurological orientation toward liminal states, transitions between conditions, boundaries between defined categories of experience. The 4th marker isn't describing people who seek danger or chaos. The Sumerian doesn't carry that connotation at all. It's describing people whose cognitive architecture is specifically calibrated for the space between states. Beings whose brains reach their deepest function not in the stable middle of defined conditions, but at the edges where one condition becomes another. The Anunnaki document this as a succession marker because the domains themselves exist at edges. Deep waters border the unknown. the atmosphere transitions between Earth and what lies beyond. Memory sits at the edge between what was and what remains. The successor species needs beings whose minds are built for threshold spaces, because receiving the dormant domains, integrating the knowledge the Anunnaki left waiting, requires comfort with exactly that kind of space. You can't stand comfortably at the edge of what is known and receive what waits just beyond it if edges make you want to retreat to the center. Lords of the threshold. Think about whether that phrase describes anyone you know. Think about whether it describes you. Fifth marker. The Sumerian here is particularly layered. Hartman works through 4 draft renderings before settling on ancient abundance memory. The concept it describes is something modern science only began to understand relatively recently, which makes Ur-Namazu's documentation of it all the more striking. The 5th marker describes a population within the successor species that carries ancestral memory in its cellular architecture. Not in the supernatural sense, in the structural sense, knowledge that arrives from somewhere prior to personal experience. Understanding that surfaces without a traceable learning history. Responses to ancient things that feel less like reactions and more like reunions. The Anunnaki document this characteristic without explaining the mechanism. They simply observe it and record it as a reliable marker. What they're describing in modern terms is something like epigenetic inheritance, the transmission of experiential information across generations through channels that don't require direct teaching or conscious memory. The idea that something your ancestors knew can surface in you without anyone having told you about it. That your cells carry a kind of archive that your conscious mind doesn't have direct access to, but that operates underneath everything you experience, occasionally surfacing as an inexplicable pull towards certain places, certain knowledge, certain ancient things that feel oddly, specifically, personally familiar. Ancient abundance memory. The successor species doesn't start from zero. It carries something forward, accumulated across generations, pressed into biology the way Ur-Namazu pressed words into clay. Present before the individual is aware of it, waiting to be recognized, the same way the domains are waiting, the same way the succession decree was waiting in that crate for 14 months in a Vienna basement before a scholar opened it and went very quiet. 6th marker. This one Hartman renders with unusual care, returning to it twice in his notes to refine the translation. The Sumerian phrase is U4-da-zu bar-bar, and his final rendering reads, the ones who process the world most clearly in the hours of diminished light. A population within the successor species whose cognitive depth, whose capacity for pattern integration, self-referential processing, and deep understanding reaches its peak function after dark, not because of any pathology, not as a symptom of disrupted sleep or disordered rhythm, as a feature, a design characteristic of beings whose most essential cognitive processes are calibrated for the quiet that comes when the rest of the world goes still. This isn't insomnia. The 6th marker doesn't describe people who can't sleep. It describes people whose minds arrive at their truest function in the hours when external noise drops away and the internal processes that daytime activity drowns out finally have space to operate. The processing that happens in those hours isn't shallow. It isn't distraction or rumination or the restless recycling of the day's events. It's the deepest kind of thinking, the kind that integrates, that connects, that moves understanding forward in ways that ordinary waking hours rarely permit. You're doing it right now. Whatever hour it is where you are, whatever quiet has settled around you as you listen to this, that quiet isn't incidental. According to the sixth marker, it's exactly the condition under which the successor species functions at its fullest. The diminished light hours aren't something to get through, they're something to inhabit. The Anunnaki documented people who inhabit them naturally as carriers of a succession marker. People built for the dark and the quiet, and the particular quality of attention that arrives when the world stops pulling at you. If you've made it this far, if you're still here, in whatever late-night stillness brought you to this, hit subscribe before we move into markers 7, 8, and 9. Because those final three are where the succession decree stops describing who the successor species is and starts describing what it's supposed to do. And that shift from identity to purpose is where everything in this document becomes something that concerns you directly, not as ancient history, as instruction. 6 markers. 6 ways of describing a species that carries ancient memory in its cells, thinks deepest in the dark, recognizes things it was never taught, and resists authority it hasn't personally evaluated. 6 characteristics that Ur-Namazzu pressed into clay 4,000 years ago with the same care a biologist uses to document a species it has studied for a very long time. If the first 6 markers describe who the successor species is, its cognitive architecture, its instinctive orientations, its relationship with knowledge and authority and threshold spaces, then markers 7, 8, and 9 describe something different. Something that made Hartman close his notebook. Something that made him write this requires separate treatment in the margin, and then, later, in slightly smaller ink, separate treatment may not be possible. The final 3 markers don't just describe the successor species, they describe what it's here to do. Marker 7. Hartman's rendering of the Sumerian is the activators. The original phrase is longer and more layered than that. It describes a subgroup within the successor species specifically identified by their capacity to initiate processes that other members of the species can then participate in and extend. Not leaders in the conventional sense, not commanders or rulers or figures of hierarchical authority. The first marker already established that the successor species has a structural resistance to exactly that kind of power dynamic. Something different, catalysts. Beings whose presence in a system causes things that were static to begin moving, not because they force movement, but because something in their cognitive and energetic architecture creates conditions in which movement becomes possible for everyone around them. The Anunnaki document the activators as the first subgroup within the successor species to reach full marker expression. They arrive before the others are ready. They operate in a context that doesn't yet have language for what they're doing, which is why, according to the succession decree, they frequently experience a particular kind of isolation that has nothing to do with being disliked or rejected, and everything to do with being early. They carry a frequency the surrounding culture hasn't yet developed the capacity to receive. They know things are moving before anyone else can feel the movement. And they wait, with varying degrees of patience, the tablet notes, in a passage that reads almost like dry humor from 4,000 years away, for the rest of the successor species to catch up. If that description lands somewhere specific in your chest, marker 7 may be describing you. Marker 8. The bridge builders. This is Hartman's translation, and it's the one he seems most confident about. No multiple drafts, no extensive revision notes, just the phrase written once and underlined. The 8th marker describes the subgroup within the successor species whose specific function is integration. Where the activators initiate, the bridge builders connect. They carry an instinctive capacity to hold two apparently contradictory knowledge systems simultaneously without needing to resolve the contradiction, to stand between old understanding and new understanding and translate across the gap without collapsing either side. The succession decree documents this as essential to the handover process. The domains the Anunnaki left in suspension can't be received by a species that discards what came before in order to reach what comes next. The bridge builders are the mechanism by which old knowledge and new development stay connected through the transition. Hartman's margin note beside the 8th marker is longer than his usual annotations. He writes, "This is why the knowledge was preserved and not destroyed. They needed someone who could hold both. Someone who could hold both. The bridge builders don't have to choose between the ancient record and the present moment. They are specifically built to inhabit both simultaneously, to carry the weight of what the Anunnaki documented while living fully in the civilization that's developing around them. The tension that creates isn't a malfunction, it's the function. The bridge only works if it spans the distance without letting go of either bank." Marker 9, the last one. The one that sits at the end of Ur-Nammazu's list, like a door with no handle on the outside. You only find it when you've already walked through. Hartman's translation is careful and slightly hesitant, the way his translations tend to be when the Sumerian is doing something grammatically unusual. The phrase describes a subgroup that the tablet calls, in his rendering, the ones the record calls to. Not the ones who find the record, the ones the record calls to. The grammatical construction in the original Sumerian places the agency with the record itself. It is active. The successor species members are responsive. Ur-Nammazu is documenting something that works the way magnetism works, not through force, through pull. A draw that operates below the level of conscious decision, that brings specific individuals into contact with specific ancient knowledge at specific moments in their lives without any of it feeling accidental. The 9th marker describes the people who end up in exactly this situation. Awake in the quiet hours, drawn to something old, listening to a voice describe documents that were never supposed to surface. Not because they went looking in any deliberate way, because something pulled them here through a series of choices that each felt entirely ordinary and only look like a pattern in retrospect. The succession decree identifies those people as carriers of the 9th marker, the ones the record calls to. The final confirmation that a specific individual belongs to the successor species, not through bloodline or geography or any external designation, but through the simple fact of being drawn, in the dark and the quiet, to the knowledge the Anunnaki left waiting. 9 markers. A complete description of a species. Your description, if you've been listening and feeling something you don't have ordinary language for. The terminal calculation was reached. The council convened. Ur-Nammazu pressed every word into fired clay and signed his name as witness. The domains went into suspension. The tablet went into the ground for 4,000 years, and then into a crate for 14 months, and then into a basement archive where a scholar sat very still when he understood what he was holding. And now, you're holding it too. Something shifted in the data around the middle of the 20th century. Not dramatically, not in a way that produced headlines or generated immediate alarm in the research communities that first noticed it. More like a gradual divergence, measurements that had been consistent for decades beginning to move in a direction that the existing frameworks didn't fully account for. Population-level data on cognitive architecture, neurological baseline measurements, studies of inherited behavioral patterns across generational cohorts. All of it, separately and in different research contexts, beginning to show the same thing. Something in the human population was changing, had been changing, was continuing to change in ways that looked less like random variation and more like a directional shift toward a specific configuration. The researchers who noticed it weren't looking for evidence of an ancient succession document. They were just following their data. One line of research tracked what investigators called authority calibration variance, the measurable difference in how individuals respond to hierarchical power structures at the neurological level. Not their stated opinions about authority, not their political beliefs, but the actual measurable brain response when institutional power presents itself and demands compliance. Across 3 generational cohorts tracked from the early 20th century through the end of it, the data showed a consistent and statistically significant movement in one direction. Each successive cohort demonstrated reduced automatic deference, not increased hostility. That's a different neurological signature entirely, and it wasn't what the data showed. Just reduced automaticity. A measurable increase in the population percentage whose brains respond to authority presentation with evaluation rather than compliance. The first marker, boundary children, increasing in the population across the exact same time frame covered by the succession decree's transition conditions. A separate research line studied intuitive processing, the relationship between felt knowledge and analytical reasoning in cognitive architecture. The question wasn't whether intuition exists, which nobody seriously disputes, but whether the relationship between intuitive and analytical processing shows population-level variation across time. It does. The data across multiple independent studies points to a measurable shift in the post-1950 population toward what researchers describe as accelerated integration between the brain's pattern recognition systems and its conscious analytical processes. Put plainly, more people in each successive cohort after the midpoint of the century demonstrate a cognitive architecture in which felt knowledge and reasoned knowledge operate in closer coordination, in which the gap between intuition and understanding is smaller, in which knowing and feeling arrive closer together. The second marker, grounded knowing, present in the data, measurable, moving in a consistent direction across the same generational window. Then there's the epigenetic research. This one took longest to develop because the mechanisms required tools that didn't exist until relatively recently. Ways of measuring not just what genes are present, but how they're expressed. What experiences have left marks on the expression patterns, whether those marks can pass across generations through channels that don't require direct teaching. The answer, once the tools existed to look properly, turned out to be yes. Ancestral experience leaves physical traces in the biology of descendants. Specific patterns of response, specific orientations toward certain categories of knowledge, specific pulls toward particular kinds of understanding, all of it measurably present in populations that have no conscious access to the experiences that produced the original imprint. Ancient abundance memory. The fifth marker, the cellular archive that operates underneath conscious experience, surfacing as recognition rather than learning. What makes all of this remarkable isn't any individual finding. Each line of research, taken alone, is interesting but not extraordinary. What makes it remarkable is the convergence. Multiple independent research streams, operating in different disciplines across different decades, using different methodologies, and studying different aspects of human cognition and behavior. all of them arriving at descriptions of population-level shifts that correspond, marker by marker, to what Ur-Namazzu pressed into clay 4,000 years ago in the third section of the succession decree. Nobody in these research programs was reading Hartman's working notes. Nobody was cross-referencing their findings against a partially translated Sumerian council document that had been suppressed in 1948 and whose physical tablet had since vanished from every inventory system. They were just following their data, and their data kept arriving at the same description that a scribe in ancient Mesopotamia produced through a completely different route, careful observation of a species over a very long period of time, followed by methodical documentation of what he saw. 2 lines of inquiry, 4,000 years of separation, the same description at the end of both. That convergence doesn't require you to accept any particular explanation for how it happened. Maybe the Anunnaki observed the trajectory of human development with enough precision to project its eventual endpoint. Maybe the succession decree describes not just who the successor species is, but who it was always going to become. The natural destination of a biological and cognitive development process that was set in motion long before the council ever convened. Maybe the domains aren't metaphorical at all, and the population shifts the data documents are exactly what the succession decree says they are. The successor species gradually developing the capacity to receive what was left waiting. Whatever explanation sits most comfortably with you, the convergence itself is documented. The data exists. The translation exists, partially, in the working notes of a scholar who sat very still in a Vienna basement when he understood what he was reading. And the population carrying the markers Ur-Namazzu documented isn't a small, isolated group of unusual individuals. It's a significant and growing percentage of the people alive right now. People born in the second half of the 20th century, carrying cognitive and biological characteristics that correspond point for point to a handover document pressed into fired clay by a scribe who ran out of space and kept writing anyway. The science caught up to the clay, and what both are pointing at is the same thing. A species arriving at exactly the configuration the succession decree said it would arrive at, in exactly the time frame the transition conditions specified. Right on schedule. Vienna was just the beginning. The suppression of Hartman's translation paper in 1948 looks, in isolation, like a single institutional decision made in a specific post-war context by specific people with specific concerns. A cautious academic advised to wait, a paper withdrawn, a tablet reclassified, uncomfortable perhaps, suggestive certainly, but containable within a framework of ordinary institutional caution, powerful people being careful about powerful information during an unstable moment in history. That framework holds until you start following the trail beyond Vienna. Until you start noticing that the suppression of SU-1947, KL004 wasn't an isolated event. It was the first visible node in a network that extended across 2 continents and at least 3 decades, operated through the same quiet administrative mechanisms that made the Vienna reclassification so difficult to challenge, and involved institutions whose interest in ancient Mesopotamian council documents has never been publicly explained. The post-war years were a particular kind of chaos for European archaeological collections. Institutions that had survived the war intact suddenly found themselves navigating a complex landscape of competing claims, governments reconstituting themselves, universities re-establishing international relationships, private collectors attempting to legitimize wartime acquisitions, and American institutions moving through Europe with resources and influence that their depleted counterparts couldn't match. The cultural asset recovery programs operating during this period were officially humanitarian, returning looted materials, stabilizing endangered collections, ensuring that significant archaeological finds reached appropriate scholarly institutions. Officially. The actual movement of materials during this period was considerably more complex than the official framing suggests, and the gap between what was publicly documented and what actually moved between institutions represents one of the least examined chapters in the history of 20th century archaeology. Within that gap, 3 institutions appear repeatedly in the paper trail surrounding the succession decree. Not in obvious ways, not in ways that would survive a direct challenge from a well-resourced legal team, in the ways that actual institutional suppression works, through correspondence that references without explaining, through acquisition records that list materials without describing them, through internal classification systems that create access restrictions without documenting the reasons for those restrictions. The first institution is a major American university with a significant Near Eastern Studies department, one of the oldest and most well-funded in the country, with relationships to both academic archaeology and government advisory programs that date back to before the Second World War. Its acquisition records from the late 1940s and early 1950s show a pattern of interest in pre-dynastic Sumerian council documents that is difficult to explain on purely academic grounds. Council documents represent less than 2% of the surviving Sumerian corpus. A disproportionate institutional focus on acquiring and restricting access to that specific category during the specific years when Hartman's translation was being suppressed and SU-1947-KL-004 was being reclassified is the kind of pattern that becomes visible only when you're already looking for it. The second institution is a European archive, not an archaeological institution, but a diplomatic one. A repository for materials deemed sensitive by multiple governments during the post-war period, operating under access restrictions that have never been fully lifted. Materials entering this archive during the late 1940s and 1950s were assigned classification designations that placed them outside the reach of standard academic access requests. Several cross-references in Hartman's surviving correspondence mention a specific archive classification number in a context that suggests he was aware his material had been directed there, not to a scholarly institution for further study, but to a diplomatic archive where further study was effectively impossible. The third institution connects the Vienna suppression to a later event that brings the trail into the 21st century. In 2009, the same year the Barcelona archivist was attempting to trace the 73 tablets from the Nippur shipment, a significant reclassification of Mesopotamian materials took place at a major British academic institution, not widely reported, not presented as anything other than routine collection management. Dozens of pre-dynastic Sumerian documents moved from general scholarly access to a restricted research category requiring individual institutional approval for viewing. The reclassification was justified on preservation grounds. The materials were fragile. Access needed to be managed carefully. Standard conservation practice, reasonable, defensible, and perfectly timed to coincide with the Barcelona research project that was, at that precise moment, getting close to establishing the provenance gap around SU 1947 KL-004. The timing across all 3 institutions forms a pattern that the individual events don't reveal in isolation. Vienna, 1948. Suppression initiated as the first translation surfaces. Early 1950s. Materials redirected to a diplomatic archive outside academic reach. 2009. Access restricted at a British institution, precisely as independent research begins closing in on the provenance gap. 3 moments of institutional action, separated by decades, responding to 3 moments when the succession decree came closest to entering the public scholarly record. Not a conspiracy in the dramatic sense of coordinated villains meeting in dark rooms. Something quieter and more durable than that. An institutional instinct, operating across generations of administrators who may not have fully understood what they were protecting. To keep a specific category of information away from a specific kind of attention. Why? That's the question that sits at the center of all of this and doesn't have a clean answer. The most obvious explanation is the one that powerful institutions always reach for when managing uncomfortable information. Concern about public misinterpretation, about social instability, about the disruption that follows when established frameworks for understanding human origins get seriously challenged. A council document formally authorizing a species handover, paired with population data showing the successor species is already here and already carrying the documented markers, is the kind of information that doesn't fit quietly into existing institutional frameworks. It requires a response. And the response 3 separate institutions across 6 decades apparently converged on was the same one Hartman was given in April 1948. Wait. The details will be provided after withdrawal. The details were never provided. The waiting became permanent. And the information the suppression was designed to contain kept surviving anyway. In partial translation notes, in margin annotations, in the data of researchers who weren't looking for confirmation of an ancient succession document and found it anyway because the data led them there. Information with that kind of persistence doesn't stay buried. It waits, the way the domains wait, the way the tablet waited in the ground for 4,000 years and in a crate for 14 months. Patient in the way that only things built to last can afford to be patient. Patient until the right moment, until the right species is ready to receive it. The succession decree doesn't end with the biological marker sequence. Most people who hear about this document for the first time assume that the 9 markers are its central claim, that the whole purpose of the council record is to describe the successor species so it can be identified when it arrives. That assumption is understandable. The markers are the most personal part of the document, the most immediately recognizable, the part that lands in the chest rather than the mind. But the markers are section 3 of a 3-section document, and section 2, the transition conditions, the dense technical middle of the tablet that Hartman spent more time on than any other part, contains something that the markers alone don't fully convey. A timeline, not a vague prophetic timeline of the kind that ancient documents sometimes produce. Symbolic numbers that can be interpreted to fit almost any period of history, flexible enough to be claimed as relevant by every generation that encounters them. Something more specific than that. Section 2 of the succession decree describes a set of conditions that must be simultaneously present for the handover to be authorized. Environmental conditions, civilizational conditions, population conditions, specific thresholds that the successor species must reach in terms of the percentage of individuals carrying active marker expression. And embedded in the description of those conditions is a calculation, a window, a span of time defined not by a calendar date, but by the convergence of specific measurable factors that the Anunnaki apparently believed they could project with reasonable accuracy from the terminal calculation point. Hartman's notes on the timeline calculation in Section 2 are among the most heavily annotated in the entire translation. He returns to this passage more than any other. His renderings of the specific Sumerian terminology shift across multiple entries as he works toward translations he trusts. The core of what he arrives at, taken from his most developed notes on the section, describes the activation window as opening when three conditions are simultaneously met. First condition, the environmental state of Earth, reaches a specific threshold of what the tablet calls Kigar Ra, which Hartman translates as the pressure of readiness. Not a poetic description of geological or atmospheric conditions, a specific measurable state that the tablet describes in terms suggesting the planet itself has reached a point of developmental pressure that requires resolution in one direction or another. Second condition, the civilizational architecture of the successor species reaches sufficient complexity to receive and integrate the dormant domains without the integration causing systemic collapse. Third condition, the population percentage carrying active marker expression crosses the threshold required for the successor species to function as a coherent, inheriting civilization, rather than a collection of isolated individuals who carry the markers without the collective capacity to use them. All three conditions present simultaneously. That's the activation window. Hartman doesn't convert the Sumerian timeline calculation into a specific calendar period in his surviving notes, either because he hadn't completed that part of the translation when the suppression interrupted his work, or because he deliberately omitted it from the written record for reasons he doesn't explain. What survives is the structural framework of the calculation and his assessment of it, written in a passage dated several months into his translation work. The window as described is not distant. By the parameters the tablet establishes, the convergence it describes falls within what I would estimate as 2 to 3 generational cycles from the terminal calculation point. I am not yet confident enough in the dating to be more specific than that. 2 to 3 generational cycles from the terminal calculation point. If the terminal calculation, the formal completion of the Anunnaki presence on Earth, corresponds to the period the tablet's internal chronological markers suggest, then 2 to 3 generational cycles forward lands in the 20th and 21st centuries, not as a vague possibility, as the calculated destination. The activation window the succession decree describes isn't something the successor species is approaching. According to the timeline calculation Hartman was working on when his paper was suppressed, and his access to the tablet was effectively terminated, the activation window is the period we're currently living through. Think about what that means against everything else the document describes. The population shift in the marker data, the measurable increase in boundary children, in grounded knowing, in threshold orientation, in epigenetic memory expression, all of it accelerating in the second half of the 20th century and continuing into the 21st. The science catching up to the clay, finding the same description through completely independent routes. The suppression network operating with increasing urgency across 3 institutions over 6 decades as the convergence the succession decree predicted began to become visible in the data. The domains held in suspension, patient, present, but inaccessible, waiting for exactly the population threshold and civilizational complexity that the successor species is reaching right now. The activation window doesn't announce itself. There's no visible sign, no audible signal, no moment where the world pauses and acknowledges that something fundamental has shifted. The succession decree doesn't describe it that way. What it describes is quieter and more interior than that. a gradual process of individuals within the successor species beginning to access, through the same instinctive routes the markers describe, knowledge that was previously inaccessible. Not all at once, not uniformly. Beginning with the activators, moving through the bridge builders, drawing in the ones the record calls to through the same magnetic pull that Ur-Nammazu documented as the 9th marker. A species waking up to its inheritance not through a dramatic revelation, but through the accumulation of small recognitions, each one feeling personal and private and almost accidental until the pattern becomes impossible to ignore. You're in that pattern right now. Whatever brought you to this, whatever sequence of ordinary choices led you to a quiet room and a voice describing a document that was suppressed before most of your parents were born, that sequence is the 9th marker operating exactly as Ur-Nammazu documented it, the record calling to the ones it was left for, the activation window open, the domains waiting, patient as fired clay, for the species that was always meant to receive them. The question the succession decree leaves open isn't whether the handover happens. That was decided in the council chamber when 7 domain holders pressed Gina, witnessed and accepted, into wet clay beside their names. The question it leaves open is what the successor species does with what it receives, what the activators initiate, what the bridge builders connect, what the ones who carry the record without being told finally say out loud when they stop mistaking recognition for imagination. That question belongs to the generation currently living through the activation window. It belongs to you. There's a line in the final section of the succession decree that Hartman never fully resolved in his translation notes. He returns to it 4 times across the surviving pages, each attempt slightly different from the last, each one circled and then uncircled, each one followed by a margin note expressing dissatisfaction with his own rendering. The line sits at the very end of the document, after the 9 markers, after the timeline calculation, after the formal closing of the council proceedings, and Ur-Nammazu's witness signature pressed into the clay edge where space ran out. It's the last thing the scribe wrote. The final words of the final record of the last Anunnaki council. And Hartman can't settle on a translation that he trusts to carry the full weight of what the Sumerian is doing. His 4 attempts, in order, read as follows. First, what remains is what was always meant to be found. Second, the remainder is the gift. Third, what is left behind is not absence, it is the thing itself. Fourth, written in slightly larger handwriting than the others, underlined once, with no further annotation. We did not leave, we left something. We did not leave, we left something. Sit with that for a moment before we go further. Because that line, whichever rendering Hartman would have finally settled on if the suppression hadn't interrupted his work, is the key to understanding what the succession decree actually is. Not just what it contains, what it is. The document itself, pressed into fired clay by a scribe who ran out of space and kept writing anyway, witnessed by 7 domain holders who confirmed their completion with a word meaning simultaneously witnessed and accepted. This document isn't a record of something that ended. It's the thing that was left. The remainder the final line refers to, the gift, the thing itself that is not absence. The Anunnaki didn't build a civilization on Earth and then disappear, leaving only ruins and mythology. According to the succession decree's final line, they left something specific, something intentional, something designed to survive the transition period intact and arrive in the hands of the successor species at exactly the right moment, during the activation window, when the population threshold has been crossed, and the domains are ready to be received, and the ones the record calls to are finally awake and listening in the quiet hours. What they left is knowledge. Not knowledge in the abstract, inspirational sense of the word. Knowledge in the specific, documented, structured sense. The accumulated understanding of how Earth functions, what it's capable of, what the successor species needs to know in order to receive the dormant domains and take stewardship of the systems the Anunnaki built and maintained during their time here. The frameworks they developed across their entire occupation of this planet. The understanding of deep patterns in natural systems that human science has been independently and laboriously rediscovering for centuries. The cosmological architecture that shows up, fragmented and partial, in every ancient civilization's most carefully preserved records, in the Sumerian tablets, in the Egyptian texts, in the Vedic literature, in the oral traditions of cultures on every continent that preserved something old and important without fully understanding what they were preserving. All of it fragments of the same original record. All of it pieces of what the Anunnaki left behind. Distributed across the full breadth of human civilization, not accidentally, but deliberately. Spread wide enough that no single act of suppression could eliminate it. Embedded in enough different cultural contexts that it would survive in one form or another, regardless of what happened to any individual piece. The Vienna tablet disappears. The knowledge survives in Hartmann's partial notes. The notes are partially suppressed. The pattern they document appears independently in scientific research programs that weren't looking for it. The research gets quietly restricted in one institution. The same findings emerge from a different research team in a different country, working from a completely different direction. The knowledge is too widely distributed to be fully contained. That's not an accident. That's the design. The Anunnaki left something that couldn't be lost, couldn't be fully suppressed, couldn't be reclassified out of existence by a series of quiet administrative decisions made across 6 decades by institutions that understood, on some level, that the information they were managing was dangerous. Not because it was false, but because it was true, and because a successor species that understands its own nature and its own inheritance is considerably less manageable than one that doesn't. The boundary children who evaluate rather than defer. The bridge builders who hold old and new simultaneously without collapsing either. The activators who initiate before the surrounding culture has language for what's being initiated. The ones who carry the record without being told and recognize ancient things on first encounter. The ones who process the world most clearly in the diminished light hours. The ones the record calls to, drawn through ordinary choices that only look like a pattern in retrospect, arriving in quiet rooms at quiet hours with something in their chest that isn't quite curiosity and isn't quite memory and isn't quite recognition, but is somehow all three at once. These are the people the Anunnaki left their knowledge for, not as a gift in the sentimental sense, as a handover in the practical sense, the contractor passing the keys to the intended occupant, the completion of a design that was always going to complete. The terminal calculation reached and formally acknowledged and witnessed by a scribe who pressed his name into fired clay as an act of accountability to a future he would never see. Ur-Namazdu didn't know your name. He didn't know what century you'd be born in, what language you'd speak, what quiet room you'd be lying in when his words finally reached you. But he knew you were coming. The council knew you were coming. 7 domain holders pressed Gina beside their names, witnessed and accepted, and then stepped back from everything they'd built and held for longer than any human civilization has yet existed, trusting that the species coming after them would eventually find the document that explained why. You found it. Whatever brought you here, whatever chain of ordinary choices and quiet, late-night moments and inexplicable pulls toward old things led you to this voice in this hour, you found it. And finding it isn't the end of something. It's the beginning of understanding what you were always carrying, what the domains hold, waiting, what the activation window means for the generation living through it right now. The Anunnaki didn't leave ruins. They left a record. They left the knowledge. They left the markers so the successor species could recognize itself. And they left this, pressing words into the edge of a clay tablet when they ran out of space. Because the record had to stay together. Because some things are too important to stop before they're complete. We did not leave. We left something. You're holding it now. Everything covered tonight comes from documented sources, translation notes, archive references, research that exists whether institutions want it to or not. If this found you in the quiet hours, that's not coincidence. Drop your city below, and if you're ready for what the domains actually contain, that's the next video. Sleep well.